What if every creature you cast drew you a card, grew your commander, and burned down the entire table? Most decks storm off with spells. This one storms off with creatures. Eshki, Temur's Roar. Eshki is one of the face commanders of the Tarkir Dragonstorm precons. And honestly, I have no idea why no one is talking about her, because this card is absurdly strong and it delivers one of the most explosive and fun gameplay patterns you can get out of a commander. For just 3 mana in Temur colors, you get a 2/2 body that turns every creature we cast into 3 layers of value. First up, every creature spell we cast will put a +1/+1 counter on Eshki, and that ability alone already makes her scale naturally over the course of the game. You will have a massive commander body for just playing the game normally, no extra setup needed. Then if that creature you cast has power 4 or greater, you also get to draw a card. And this is what turns Eshki into an absolute value engine. Its consistent card advantage directly stapled onto our game plan, meaning we'll barely ever run out of gas. And finally, the big payoff: if the creature you cast has power 6 or greater, Eshki will deal damage equal to her power to each opponent. Which means once she's stacked up with a few +1/+1 counters, every big creature you cast will turn into a table-wide burn spell. And yes, before you ask, if you cast a creature with 6 or more power, it will trigger all 3 parts of her ability. You'll get the counter on Eshki, you'll get to draw a card, and you get to take a huge chunk out of your opponent's life totals. She rewards you for doing one of the most fun things in Magic: casting really impactful high power creatures. And that is exactly what this deck does. I've built this Eshki deck around some sort of creature storm playstyle, chaining creature after creature, stacking up on those draw triggers and dealing more and more table-wide damage as the game goes on. You're constantly in motion and each creature you cast will fuel the next. More cards, more damage, more pressure until your opponents just can't keep up. And trust me, this deck snowballs fast. If your opponents don't disrupt you, you can easily close out the game by turn 5 or turn 6. And with the right mana dorks in your opening hand, you can even storm off and burn down the entire table as early as turn 4. And the best part, we don't play any tutors or combos in this Eshki deck, because they didn't really fit into the deck and we don't need them with Eshki anyways. You just cast your creatures, trigger Eshki, and she will handle all the rest. As per usual, I will be going over every single card in the list and explaining why I decided to include it. This video is divided up in 5 categories: the 6+ power creatures, acceleration, card draw and support, interaction and protection, and the lands. And let's get started with the most interesting category: the 6+ power creatures. Every single one of these creatures will trigger all 3 of Eshki's abilities whenever we cast them. They will grow her, they will draw as a card, and they will deal table-wide damage. Whether they come with their own powerful ETB ability or just raw stats, these are the cards that this deck is all about. Ugel, Titan of Nature's Wrath. Whenever this 3 mana 6/6 creature enters the battlefield or attacks, we get to draw a card, gain 3 life, and we get the ability to put a land card from our hand onto the battlefield, essentially giving us a free growth spiral whenever we play this. If it entered the battlefield through any means that's not escaping it, we do have to sacrifice it. But honestly, that doesn't really matter, because when we do have Eshki on the battlefield and we just cast this for the 3 mana, we will get to put a counter on Eshki, we will get to draw 2 cards, we will gain 3 life, and we will get an Eshki burn trigger of it. It will then go to the graveyard, but honestly that's perfectly fine, since the value it just generated for only 3 mana is absolutely ridiculous. And whenever this card is in your graveyard for 4 mana and exiling 5 other cards from your graveyard, you actually get to escape it. Now I'm gonna be honest, in all the games I played with this deck, I've never ever escaped Ugel. But I suppose later in the game, if you ran out of gas and you don't have any other cards to play, you can still use its escape cost to get some extra value. Dreamtide Whale, a massive 3 mana 7/5 body. And this creature has the Vanishing 2 mechanic, meaning it will enter the battlefield with 2 time counters on it. At the beginning of our upkeep, we do have to remove 1 time counter from this creature, and if we remove the last time counter, this creature gets sacrificed. On top of being a huge creature body for just 3 mana, it also has an additional ability which scales like crazy with its own Vanishing mechanic. Whenever any player casts their second spell in a turn, we get to proliferate, meaning we get to pick any number of permanents that had any sort of counter on them and we get to give them an additional one of those counters. Now obviously proliferate is just fantastic with Eshki since she will always have at least one +1/+1 counter on it, and Dreamtide Whale will just give her another one, resulting in her body growing even faster, and her last ability will deal more table-wide damage thanks to this. And whenever you proliferate, you can also add more time counters on Dreamtide Whale, so it will stay on the battlefield for more turns. And trust me, in a game of Commander, you will usually get to proliferate like 2 to 3 times in every single turn cycle, since people will always be casting multiple spells per turn. Next up, we have 3 really simple huge creature bodies that will only cost you 3 mana. The first one being Phyrexian Soulgorger. It's a massive 8/8 body you can cast for only 3 generic mana. Now obviously a huge creature body like this with such a low cost will come with a downside. It has cumulative upkeep, sacrifice a creature. At the beginning of your upkeep you will have to put an H counter on this creature. Then for each H counter it has, you will have to pay the cumulative upkeep cost, in this case being sacrificing a creature. Now honestly we don't really care about the downside of this card in the deck. The only thing we care about is that it is a really huge creature body we get for a really low cost. Whenever you cast it, it will obviously trigger all 3 parts of Eshki's ability, generate you some huge value in the process, and the next upkeep, if you don't want to sacrifice a creature, you can just sacrifice this creature itself. It already generated you a ton of value anyways. Relic Golem. Like the previous card, you get a 6 power creature you can cast for only 3 colorless mana, which then in turn, whenever you have Eshki on the field, will replace itself by drawing you a card. It will grow Eshki's body and it will deal a ton of damage to the entire table. The only reason cards like this are included in the deck is just to get additional Eshki triggers for a really low mana cost. And the last really simple, low cost, high power creature is Pugnacious Hammerskull. For just 3 mana you get a 6/6 dinosaur, and whenever this creature attacks and you don't control another dinosaur, you have to put a stun counter on it, meaning it won't untap on your next untap step. But you will win most games through just storming off, playing a huge amount of creatures and just winning thanks to Eshki's burn damage. Anzrach the Quake Mole. For just 4 mana you will get a massive 8 power mole god. And on top of being a really high power creature for a really low mana cost, this card has an insane ability. Whenever this creature becomes blocked, we get to untap all our creatures and we get an additional combat phase after this one. Now obviously no one is ever going to block Anzrach voluntarily, and that's where his activated ability comes in. For the huge cost of 7 mana, your opponents will be forced to block Anzrach, which will result in you getting a guaranteed extra combat phase. Now extra combat phases in a huge creature deck like this one will always allow you to deal a huge amount of damage. But what's really great about this ability is that you also get to untap all creatures you control, including all your mana producing creatures, which usually will end up with you having more mana available, just being able to cast more creature spells and get more Eshki burn damage. Arixmetes, Slumbering Isle, a 4 mana 12/12 creature that will enter the battlefield tapped, and it will enter with 5 slumber counters on it. And for as long as this creature has at least 1 slumber counter on it, it isn't actually a creature, it will be a land, meaning you can't actually swing or block with it. But whenever you cast a spell, you get to remove 1 slumber counter from this card. And since we are some sort of a storm deck, it will be really easy to get 5 casts in. But that being said, it's not about getting the 12/12 creature body, because just paying the 4 mana to get 3 Eshki triggers and get a land on the battlefield that taps for 2 mana is already a really great deal. Purphoros, God of the Forge. For 4 mana you get a 6/5 indestructible enchantment creature. But for as long as your devotion to red, meaning the mana pips impermanence you control, is less than 5, Purphoros won't actually be a creature, he will just be an enchantment. Having an additional 6/5 indestructible body to swing with will always be a really good thing, but it is all about the fact that this card will give you 3 Eshki triggers whenever you cast it. And it doesn't really matter how much your devotion to red is at the time you cast it, because on the stack Purphoros will always be a 6 power creature. And whenever you have Purphoros on the battlefield, whether it is a creature or an enchantment, whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you will deal 2 damage to each opponent. And since we are a creature storm deck that plays a total of 45 creatures, we will be getting a ton of precons triggers over the course of the game. And this does add up really nicely with Eshki stable white damage. The Foretold Soldier, one of the weirder cards in this deck. For 4 mana you get a 6/6 body that also has the Foretell mechanic, meaning whenever this card is in your hand you can pay 2 generic mana to exile it face down. Then on a later turn you will be able to cast it straight from exile by paying its Foretell cost, in this case being 2 mana. And the Foretell mechanic is a really awesome mechanic to set up some explosive storm turns with Eshki, since if you just have 2 mana left on any given turn you can exile this card from your hand, and when you are about to storm off with Eshki you will be able to get 3 triggers out of her for just the 2 mana. It's some sort of an early game investment you can make to get more value on the turn you actually decide to storm off and try to win the game. And whenever this creature deals damage we actually have to exile it again and it gets foretold again. This card is basically a 6 power creature that just keeps coming back and you can just keep exiling it and recast it again to get more and more triggers. And I can guarantee you whenever you play this card your opponents will have to pick it up and read it because they will have never seen this card used before. Defiler of Vigor, a 5 mana trample body that's basically made for this type of creature storm deck. For as long as this creature is on the battlefield, whenever we would cast a green permanent spell, we can pay 2 life instead of paying the cost of any green pips that that spell had in its mana cost. It will essentially turn any green mana symbol of cards you have into fraction green mana. You can only use this to reduce the cost of green mana pips and you can't actually pay life for generic mana costs. Whenever you have Eshki on the battlefield, the only thing that we want to be doing is just cast a creature, draw a card, cast more creatures and just keep the value loop going. And the amount of cost reduction that the Defiler of Vigor will give you is just absolutely ridiculous. And on top of that, whenever we cast a green permanent spell, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control. So obviously this will buff up all your creatures and give you a huge board state you can swing with, but it will also put +1/+1 counters on Eshki, resulting in her dealing even more table-wide damage whenever you cast something with 6 or more power. Overlord of the Houndwoods, one of my personal favorite cards we got in the Duskborn set. And this creature also has the Impending 4 mechanic, meaning instead of paying its regular mana cost, you can pay the impending cost. When you do, this card will enter the battlefield as an enchantment with 4 time counters on it. At the beginning of our end step, we get to remove one of those counters, and when there are no counters left, it will turn into a creature instead of just an enchantment. And yes, whenever you cast this creature for its impending cost, it will actually still count as you casting a 6 power creature for Eshki, and you will get all 3 of her triggers for just the 3 mana. Now that in itself is already really great, but this card actually has a really crazy ability. Whenever this card enters a battlefield, whether it be as a creature or an enchantment, you will get to create a tapped everywhere token. And this token is basically a land that has any land type, so it will tap for any color you'd like it to. A perfect way to accelerate our mana and fuel our storm turns. Sap Sunen, also known as Frog Mommy. I mean, just look at those juicy dice. For 5 mana, you get a massive reach, trample, indestructible body. But the stick Muscle Frog Mommy can't attack unless it has an even number of counters on it. And that's where her second ability comes in. At the beginning of your first main phase, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. Then if it has an odd number of counters on it, you get to draw 2 cards, which is absolutely insane because you can just play this creature, pass the turn, and by the time it's your turn again, she will get 1 counter and you will get to draw 2 cards for absolutely free. You will then not be able to block with her or swing with her since she has an odd number of counters on her, but it's all about the card draw. She basically is on some sort of a cycle. One turn she will draw you 2 cards and the other turn you will be able to swing with her. Really cool card. Summon Titan, one of the new saga creatures we got in the Final Fantasy set. For 5 mana you get a 7/7 reach trample body, which is honestly already really good value, and it also works like a saga whenever this is on the battlefield. So it will enter with 1 lore counter and trigger its first ability, forcing us to mill 5 cards. And this is actually quite relevant if we get to a second ability, which will give us some sort of free splendid reclamation effect, returning all our lands from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. And with the amount of fetch lands that we are running in this deck, and due to the fact that we had to mill 5 cards before this ability, we will always be accelerating our mana by a ton thanks to this. And if it sticks around for another turn, it will trigger its last ability, giving another creature we control +X and trample until the end of turn. X being the amount of lands we control. And this ability is honestly just crazy with Eshki, because let's say you get this trigger and you do control 7 lands. This ability will then give Eshki a +7/+7 stat boost, meaning every 6 power creature spell you cast will deal 7 more damage to each opponent. Xenagos, God of Revels, another indestructible god enchantment creature just like Purphoros. He also has the same devotion mechanic as Purphoros, but no matter how many devotion you have when you cast this, it will always be a 6 power creature on the stack, giving you those 3 Eshki triggers. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, Xenagos will give target creature haste and +X/+X, X being the amount of power that creature has. So essentially just doubling the power. Obviously giving one of the creatures you just played haste and a massive stat boost is fantastic to just swing at your opponent and deal a huge amount of damage. But this effect can be especially crazy in this deck if you use it to double up Eshki's power, because whenever you then cast a 6 power creature, she will essentially deal double the burn damage to each one of your opponents. I just love the amount of synergies in this deck. We're like only 25% into the video and we already covered this many cool creatures and cool synergies. Anti-Causal Vestige, a card with the warp mechanic we just got in the Edge of Eternity set. And warp basically means you can cast this creature for its warp cost. It will enter the battlefield, but it will get exiled at the beginning of your end step. And then you can cast this creature for its full mana cost from exile on a later turn. Whenever you cast this creature for its warp cost, which is only 4 generic mana, it will still count as you casting a 6 power creature and it will give you all 3 of those Eshki triggers. That in itself is already really good, but this card has a really good ability in itself. When this creature leaves the battlefield, you get to draw a card and then you get to put a permanent card from your hand with mana value equal or less than the amount of lands you control onto the battlefield tapped. And this ability is just crazy, because when you warp in this card, you will get all 3 of Eshki's triggers, get a counter, draw a card, deal a huge amount of damage. At the end of your turn, this card will then leave the battlefield, drawing you another card, and then you get to put an additional permanent from your hand onto the battlefield. You can use this to play one of your mana rocks, one of your enchantments, even one of your big value creatures if you want to. Just be warned, you have to put the card onto the battlefield and it won't actually trigger Eshki because you have to cast the card to get Eshki's trigger. And on top of that, this card can then still be cast from exile for just the 6 mana, giving you even more Eshki triggers. This is one of my absolute favorite cards in the entire deck. There hasn't been a single game where I warped this in and the value wasn't absolutely crazy. Talking about really strong cards in this deck, Chandra's Incinerator. For just 1 mana, you get a massive 6/6 trample body. And that is because the cost of this creature is reduced by X. X being the amount of non-combat damage that your opponents took this turn. If you have Eshki on the battlefield and you cast a 6 power creature, she will deal at least 3 damage to each opponent, resulting in a total of 9 non-combat damage. So the only little thing you need to do to get this creature out for just the 1 mana is cast any other 6+ power creature, which is something we will be doing every single turn. Then you can just follow up with this creature for the 1 mana, get even more Eshki triggers and generate even more value. And that cost reduction ability in itself would already be enough to include this card in the deck. But on top of that, this creature has another ability that might even be stronger than the ability I just talked about. Whenever a source deals non-combat damage to an opponent, Chandra's Incinerator will also deal that much damage to target creature that opponent controls. And this ability is just absurd when you combine it with Eshki. Let's say you play a creature, Eshki will deal 5 damage to each opponent. Chandra's Incinerator will now also per opponent deal 5 damage to one of their creatures, allowing you to remove any problematic creatures on the board just for doing what you were about to do anyways in this deck. And as I mentioned, this is some sort of a storm deck, so you will be getting multiple multiple Eshki damage triggers per turn and you will essentially be able to clear the board of your opponents. If you are about to build any sort of Eshki deck, Chandra's Incinerator is a must include card in the deck. It's just way too good. Soul of the Harvest, a 6 mana 6/6 creature that will draw as a card whenever another non-token creature enters a battlefield under our control. Since we are a creature heavy deck and we play 45 creatures, we will always get a huge amount of value from this. Even later in the game when you just play one of your mana dorks, you will get to draw a card of it, just allowing us to keep our hand filled and keep the creature storm going. Spite Bellows, a 6/1 creature that whenever it enters a battlefield will deal 6 damage to target creature, essentially acting as some sort of a removal spell. Now paying 6 mana for this type of effect really isn't that great of a deal. Good thing for us, it also has the evoke mechanic, meaning you can cast this for the low cost of 3 mana, but whenever it enters a battlefield you will have to sacrifice it instantly. But honestly that's perfectly fine, because whenever you have Eshki on the battlefield you can just pay 3 mana, get a counter on Eshki, draw a card, deal a ton of damage to each opponent, and then also removing one of your opponent's problematic creatures because you will get to ping 6 damage. Yeah, I know, mechanics like Warp and Evoke are absolutely crazy in this deck. Trumpeting Carnosaur. Whenever this 6 mana creature enters a battlefield, we get to discover 5, meaning we get to flip the top cards of our library until we hit a non-land card that has mana value 5 or less. And then we get the option to either cast that card for free or to put it into our hand. Now mechanics like Discover and Cascade are absolutely crazy when you combine them with Eshki, because if you discover into a card you actually get to cast it and then you will also get Eshki triggers of that. Just imagine it like this. You have a 6 power Eshki on the field and then you play a Trumpeting Carnosaur. You will then get 2 triggers on the stack, one being the Discover trigger of the Carnosaur and one being Eshki's trigger. First you decide to resolve the Eshki trigger, getting a counter, drawing a card and dealing 7 damage to each opponent, and then you resolve the Discover trigger. And let's say you hit a Pugnacious Hammerskull with it. You can then cast it for free and you will get another Eshki trigger. This will grow her to 8 power, draw you another card, and will deal 8 damage to each opponent. So for just casting the Carnosaur and having Eshki on the battlefield, you will have drawn 2 cards, you will have done a total of 15 damage to each opponent, and you will have 2 really big dinosaur bodies on the battlefield. And you get all of that for the low cost of 6 mana. Pretty good deal, right? And on top of that, whenever this card is in your hand, you can actually activate its ability for 3 mana and you get to ping 3 damage to any creature. Now honestly, I have never ever used this ability of this card in this type of deck, but I suppose if you really need a removal spell because you would lose the game otherwise, you can make this act as some sort of a 3 mana lightning bolt. Itali, Primal Conqueror. Yeah, we're getting into the really big creatures now. Whenever Itali enters a battlefield, each player has to exile the top cards of their deck until they hit a non-land card. And then we get to cast any number of those spells without paying their mana costs. Unlike the other Itali, people will actually have to exile cards until they hit a relevant target, and you will always get 4 spells of this one. And the value can range anywhere from hitting a Farseek to hitting an Emrakul. So you will always have an RNG factor on this card. Like the previous card, if you do have Eshki on the battlefield and you cast Itali, you will already get 3 Eshki triggers. If you then are able to exile a really huge power creature from your deck, you will get another 3 Eshki triggers. Just this in itself would be enough to include Itali in the deck. But on top of that, you will get 3 more spells from your opponents, and this can be anything. Removal, acceleration, some value creatures, or even more 6 power creatures that will get you even more Eshki triggers. Most commander players know that whenever an Itali does get to resolve, it will generate an absurd amount of value and might just close out the game on the spot. On top of that, it also has an activated ability that allows us to transform Itali, which will make it into an 11/11 trample indestructible creature body. And whenever this creature deals combat damage to an opponent, that opponent will also get that many poison counters. It's all about the front side of Itali in this deck, but later in the game it might function as a cool indestructible body that will just close out the game if you are able to connect with it once. Vaultborn Tyrant. Whenever this creature or any other 4+ power creature enters a battlefield under your control, you get to gain 3 life and draw a card. On top of the cards that you will already get to draw of Eshki. And whenever this creature would die and it wasn't a token, we actually get to create a token copy of this card. card, which will then also enter the battlefield, gain us 3 life, draw us a card, and it will have exactly the same ability as the original. And this ability is just fantastic because your opponents will need 2 sources of removal to get permanently rid of this creature. Maelstrom Wanderer, one of the most iconic Temur cards ever printed. For 8 mana, you will get a massive 7/5 body that has Cascade, Cascade. And what this essentially means is that whenever you cast it, you get to cascade twice, meaning you get to flip the top cards of your library until you hit a non-land card that has mana value 8 or less, and then you get to cast that card for free. And I already mentioned when I was talking about Trumpeting Carnosaur how insane free spellcasts can get in this kind of Eshki deck, because every creature you cascade into with this effect will get you more Eshki triggers. And sometimes just casting a Maelstrom Wanderer with Eshki on the field will close out the game on the spot. Now let's say you don't cascade into high power creatures, but you actually hit some mana dorks with this effect. Now obviously it isn't as good as getting huge power creatures, but it is actually still really relevant because Maelstrom Wanderer also gives haste to all creatures you control. You will be instantly able to use any mana dorks you hit with this cascade ability, giving you more mana and allowing you to play more creatures. Bygone Colossus, a 9 mana 9/9 creature. You can just warp this massive creature body in for the low cost of 3 mana. This is just the perfect card for when you are storming off with Eshki to get cheap additional triggers. And a huge creature body with such a low cost has even more synergies in this deck, but I will get into those later in the support section of this video. Herigast, Erupting Nullkite. If you didn't know about Herigast yet, I'm about to blow your mind because this card is absolutely insane. This card has the emerge mechanic, meaning you can cast it for its emerge cost, and in addition to paying this cost, you also get to sacrifice 1 creature. Then the emerge cost of this card will be reduced by the total mana value of that creature. Just be warned, sacrificing a creature for emerge will only reduce the colorless mana in the emerge cost, so Herigast will always cost you a minimum of 2 red mana. Now as I mentioned before, we don't really care about controlling high power creatures. The only thing we care about is just casting them with Eshki on the field. So you can just cast your big creature body, get your Eshki triggers, and then sacrifice that creature for the emerge cost to just play the next creature, which then in turn will give you even more Eshki triggers, and you can just keep the value chain going. Since Herigast will give every creature spell in your hand the emerge mechanic, you will just be continuously chaining creatures back to back, just sacrificing them, using the mana for the next one, drawing more cards, dealing more damage to the table, and the value you get of Herigast is absolutely insane. And like I mentioned, some of the warp cards are just absolutely insane for this type of effect, because you can warp in your Bygone Colossus for 3 mana. Whenever you sacrifice the Bygone Colossus, you will actually be able to reduce the cost of anything with emerge by 9 mana. So you can then essentially just follow up with a Herigast for 2 red mana and get the value loop started. And on top of that, whenever you cast a spell, you also get the option to exile your hand and draw 3 new cards, which is just perfect later in the game, especially if you have a hand filled with lands or some dead cards to just get you some excellent card advantage. Apex Devastator, a massive 10 mana creature that has Cascade, 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 Cascade. Now obviously this is a really well-known creature that some decks run as the ultimate game finisher. That being said, I really don't like the card usually, since cascading is really inconsistent and you can just hit 4 mana dorks of this and you won't generate any value. But whenever you cast this card with Eshki on the field, I can guarantee you it will win you the game every single time, because you will get all 3 parts of Eshki's ability whenever you cast this card, and then you will get an additional 1 to 4 Eshki triggers depending on what you hit with the cascade mechanic. But usually whenever you just cascade into 2 6+ power creatures, the game is essentially over, since Eshki will just deal that much damage to the entire table. Now 10 mana might seem like a lot of mana, but as you will see later in the acceleration section, we do play a ton of mana generation and cost reduction in this deck, and it's actually not that hard to cast an Apex Devastator as early as like turn 5 or 6. And the last card in this section is Ghalta Primal Hunger, a massive 12 mana 12/12 trample creature, but Ghalta's cost is reduced by the total power amongst creatures we control. Now in this deck, Ghalta is essentially a 2 mana 12/12 creature, because you will almost have 10 power on the board at any given time, either be it due to Eshki's growing body, a huge amount of 1 power mana dorks, or just just any of your high power creatures. Galta is just one of the most efficient deals in the deck. 2 mana for a 12 power creature is just crazy and perfect for when you are storming off with Eshki. And the last card I want to talk about isn't actually included in the deck. It's more some sort of an honorable mention. And that card is Phyrexian Dreadnought, which is a massive 1 mana 12/12 trample creature. But whenever this creature enters the battlefield, you have to sacrifice it unless you sacrifice creatures with a total amount of 12 power. We don't really care about the sacrifice effect in this deck, but just getting to cast a 12/12 creature body for 1 generic mana is crazy good with Eshki. That being said, this card really is unaffordable. At the time of recording this video, the lowest price for a Phyrexian Dreadnought, and that is in a bad state, is at least 100 euros. And while this card is obviously really good in this deck, I honestly wouldn't spend the money on it. It's just not worth it in my opinion. If you really like these in-depth deck tech videos and you want to support me and the channel, check out the YouTube membership program. You'll get early access to the deck list of future videos. You get some awesome Panzer MTG emojis you can use anywhere on Discord or YouTube, and you can even submit your own deck for a personal review by me. But what is in my opinion the best part is that you get access to some exclusive chat rooms in the Panzer MTG Discord server. And this is the place where I share a ton of behind the scenes stuff. What decks I'm currently working on, some projects that got scrapped, what commanders I'm testing for future videos, and even some bloopers from filming. So if either you want to support the channel or get a real behind the scenes look, hit the join button below the video or check out the link in the description below. Next up we have the acceleration section. Casting all of these big creatures does require a ton of mana. And these cards ensure we have enough of that, either to cast really big creatures or to just chain creatures back to back. First up we play 4 1 mana dorks, an Elvish Mystic, a Fiendhorn Elves, a Birds of Paradise, and a Delighted Halfling. Now all of these cards only have one purpose, and that is casting Eshki as early as turn 2. Because the games where you are able to get Eshki out as early as turn 2 are absolutely crazy, and the deck feels totally different than getting her out 1 turn later. And obviously later in the game, whenever you already have Eshki on the battlefield, casting any of these 1-drops will also give her a +1/+1 counter. Wild Growth, a 1 mana enchant land card. And Wild Growth will give us 1 additional green mana whenever the enchanted land is tapped for mana. Another really awesome way to get Eshki out as early as turn 2. And as you will see later in this video, we actually do play some cards that untap our lands. And whenever you do get to untap a land with a Wild Growth attached to it, you just get double the mana value. Exploration, a 1 mana enchantment that allows us to play an additional land every turn. Once again, a card that enables us to get Eshki out as early as turn 2, and later in the game when you are drawing a ton of cards of our draw engines or of Eshki herself, you will always end up with a huge amount of lands in your hand. You will be drawing more lands than you can actually play, and Exploration really solves that problem. Now let's get into the 2 mana dorks. And while these cards don't really help you cast Eshki earlier as turn 3 and they might feel a little awkward in the deck, you do still want as much mana available to you as possible even after you resolved Eshki, because storming off with creatures will require you a ton of mana. Spider Infestation, a new 2 mana common mana dork we just got in the Spider-Man set. And it's really simple. Whenever you cast a spell with mana value 4 or greater, you get to untap this creature. Since the entire point of this deck is just casting really big creatures back to back, this card is just the excellent mana dork. You can just tap it for mana, cast a big creature, it untaps, and you will be able to use it again to help pay for the mana cost of the next creature. And it's not a once per turn thing. You can just keep untapping this whenever you cast something with mana value 4 or greater. Fanatic of Ronas. This 2 mana dork will tap for 1 green mana. But if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you will get 4 green mana instead. And we will always be controlling a 4 power creature, either be it Eshki thanks to the counter she has, or just any of our other big creatures. And a 2 mana creature tapping for 4 mana is just ridiculous. On top of that, this card also has the Eternalize mechanic, meaning whenever this card is in our graveyard, we can activate its ability for 4 mana and we get to create a zombie token copy of this creature. that will also have exactly the same abilities. So if for some reason this card ends up in your graveyard due to a board wipe or someone milling you, you will be able to recur it later in the game. Bloom Tender. You can tap this 2-mana creature to add 1 mana of each color amongst permanents you control to your mana pool. And the value you can get of casting Bloom Tender on turn 2 can be absolutely crazy. Because on turn 3 you can then just follow up with Eshki, and then your Bloom Tender will tap for 3 mana, which you can then instantly use to follow up with any of your setup enchantments, additional mana dorks, or even some of your 6+ power creatures that only cost 3 mana and instantly get some Eshki triggers. Hurt Heirloom. This 2-mana artifact will tap for 1 mana of any color, but you can only use that mana to cast a creature spell. Now, aside from being a really solid mana rock, the reason that this card is included in the deck is its second ability. You can tap this artifact to give any creature with power 4 or greater you control trample and an additional ability until the end of turn, being whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you get to draw a card. Now, as you know by now, we will always be controlling huge power creatures, and then you can use Hurt Heirloom to give them trample, which is just excellent if an opponent has some 1/1 chump blockers for them, or to just generate you some extra card advantage by swinging with them. Gwenna, Eyes of Gaia. This 3-mana creature can be tapped to add 2 mana in any color combination to your mana pool, but you can also only use it to cast a creature spell. But the passive ability is where this card gets absolutely crazy. Whenever you cast a creature spell with power 5 or greater, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, and you also get to untap it. And the untapping part is where this card gets absolutely nuts, because the only thing you want to be doing in this deck is chaining high power creatures back to back. And what Gwenna essentially does is give you 2 mana whenever you cast one of those creatures. Especially if you do have some cost reducing creatures on the battlefield, the combination with Gwenna can be just crazy. Tap Gwenna for 2 mana, cast a big creature, untap Gwenna, tap her again, cast the next creature. Yeah, it's just the perfect fit for this deck. While building this deck, I thought Gwenna was quite an okay card, but during playtesting, this has been one of the strongest cards in the entire deck. It's the perfect creature storm enabler. Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, the controller of that creature gets to draw a card if that creature has greater power than any other creature on the battlefield. Now, obviously, this effect also works for your opponent, so if they play a big power creature, they will actually get to draw a card. But in most cases, since this entire deck is built around high power creatures, you will be getting the most use out of this. So already some really good card draw, and on top of that, for 1 green mana and tapping Selvala, we get to add any combination of colors of mana to our mana pool equal to the greatest power amongst creatures we control. And as you can imagine, this will be a huge amount of mana. Let's say, for example, you warp in a Bygone Colossus for 3 mana. You can now tap Selvala and add 9 mana to your mana pool, which you can then use to just follow up with more creatures and get the creature storm going. Temur Battlecrier. During our turn, the cost of any spell we cast will be reduced by 1 generic mana for each creature we control with power 4 or greater. And this card goes absolutely nuts in this type of deck. First up, it already has 4 power itself, so it will already reduce the cost of any spell you cast by 1 generic mana. But for each other 4 power creature you control, it will be reduced by an additional generic mana. As you've seen, we do play a ton of creatures that have 4 or more power, and thanks to Eshki's counter ability, she will always be at 4 or more power. So usually Temur Battlecrier will reduce the cost of any spell you play by about 3 to 5 mana. And since we do play a ton of creatures with generic mana in their mana cost, the value will just be ridiculous. You might be able to cast your Maelstrom Wanderer for just 4 mana. You can cast your Relic Golem or your Phyrexian Soulgorger for 0 mana. You might be able to get your Apex Devastator out for 5 mana. And this ability also applies to any alternate costs, be it the Impending mechanic, the Warp mechanic, the Evoke mechanic. Temur Battlecrier is one of the best Temur cards ever printed, and you can include it in almost any deck. Topiary Stomper. For 3 mana, you get a 4/4 dinosaur that will go fetch you up a basic land from your deck to the battlefield, filtering the basics out of your deck and accelerating your mana. And the reason why it's included in the deck is because it is an acceleration spell, and whenever you have Eshki on the field, since this is a 4 power creature, it will actually also draw you a card. Goreclaw, Terror of Kalsisma. Talking about cost reduction, this 4 mana creature will reduce the cost of any creature spell you cast with power power 4 or greater by 2 generic mana. Usually whenever you can get the Temur Battlecryer or the Goreclaw on the battlefield and you do get to untap with Eshki, the game is just over. The value they generate you is just insane. It has another really relevant ability that might actually help you close out the game. Whenever this creature attacks, each creature you control with power 4 or greater will get +1/+1 and trample until the end of turn. So later in the game, if you did manage to build a board with huge power creatures, you can just use Goreclaw to buff them all up, give them trample, and you will be able to get 1,000,000 combat damage through. Goreclaw is just the perfect creature for this deck because it both helps us with our creature storm strategy and it also helps just swing with our creatures and close out the game through combat damage. Inga and Eshki. This 4-mana creature will give all your creatures vigilance and the ability that you can tap them to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, essentially turning all your creatures into mana dorks. In this deck, we only care about casting our big creatures to get the Eshki triggers. We don't really care about them sticking to the battlefield or swinging with them. So this card turning them into mana dorks is just the perfect way to generate mana to keep the creature storm going and cast even more creatures and get even more Eshki triggers. And on top of that, whenever you cast a spell and 3 mana generated by creatures was used for that spell, you also get to draw a card. Just synergizing perfectly with this card's first ability and giving you additional card advantage for casting creatures this way. And the last card in this section is the Great Henge, a massive 9 mana rock that will tap for 2 green mana and will give you 2 life. And whenever a non-token creature would enter the battlefield under our control, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and we also get to draw a card. Now paying 9 mana for this effect is a horrible deal and no one would ever include this card in any deck. But the cost of the Great Henge is reduced by the greatest power amongst creatures we control. And since this entire deck is based around playing high power creatures, we can usually cast the Great Henge for just 2 mana. And paying just 2 mana for a card that generates us mana, life, card advantage, and counters on our creatures is a really good deal. Next up, we have the card draw and support section. Since we are some sort of a creature storm deck, we will have to make sure we never run out of creatures to actually play. And these are the cards that will ensure we always have fuel in our hand to just keep the creature storm going. I also decided to include some support cards into this section, which are the cards that synergize really well in this deck but didn't really fit into any other category. Let's get started by talking about the actual card draw spells. Elemental Bond. The simple 3 mana enchantment will draw us a card whenever a creature with power 3 or greater enters the battlefield under our control. Enchantments like this one are just the perfect fit for this type of deck. We can just play our deck like we normally would, cast our creatures, and every time we do, we will get to draw an additional card. When you combine this amount of card draw with the amount of cards we will already be drawing of Eshki, things can get absolutely ridiculous. And since enchantments that just passively sit on the battlefield drawing a card for playing creatures are this good for this type of deck, I decided to play a couple more. All of the next cards will just be more fancy versions of Elemental Bond. Garruk's Uprising. Whenever this enchantment enters the battlefield and we control a creature with 4 or greater power, it will draw us a card. And whenever a 4 power creature enters the battlefield while this enchantment is on the battlefield, we'll also get to draw a card. So no matter if you cast this later in the game when you already control some creatures or earlier in the game before you control creatures, you will always get to draw cards of Garruk's Uprising. And on top of that, passively this enchantment will also give trample to all creatures you control. A perfect way later in the game for when you have a huge board to just swing into your opponents and they won't be able to chum block your creatures with any small tokens they control. Temur's Ascendancy. Another 3 mana enchantment that will draw you a card whenever you play a creature with power 4 or greater. It will also give all creatures you control haste, meaning you can instantly swing with the huge creature bodies you play, and whenever you play one of your mana producing creatures, you will be instantly able to use them the turn you play them. The haste can really speed up everything this deck does. Kyogre, Behemoth Beckoner. Passively, this 3 mana planeswalker will once again draw you a card whenever you play a creature with power 4 or greater. And by using its ability for the low cost of only 1 loyalty, you get to untap target permanent, which baseline you can just use to untap a land and indirectly accelerate your mana, but you can also use this effect with some specific cards to actually generate a huge amount of value. You can untap a land with a wild growth attached to it, actually getting double the mana value from the wild growth. You can use it to untap a Fanatic of Ronas or a Bloom Tender to just generate you an insane amount of mana, or you can even use this to untap your Selvala and generate an absurd amount of mana. And since this Planeswalker comes in with such a high starting loyalty, it is actually pretty hard to deal with for most opponents. Outcaster Trailblazer. And like the previous cards, it will draw you a card whenever you play a creature with power 4 or greater. But on top of that, whenever this creature enters a battlefield, you get to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, which you can then use to just chain into the next creature you want to play. This card also has the plot mechanic, meaning for 3 mana you can exile this card from your hand and you can cast it for free on a later turn. Plotting this card is a perfect way to set up a storm turn with Eshki, because you will get a free 4 power creature entering the battlefield, you will get a free 1 mana, and you get an engine that will draw you cards whenever you play future high power creatures. Disciple of Realize. Whenever this 6 mana creature enters the battlefield, you get the option to sacrifice any other creature you control. Then you get to gain X life and draw X cards, X being the sacrifice creature's power. Later in the game you can then just sacrifice the huge creature bodies to this card to actually get a huge amount of card draw from them. Also works really well to sacrifice some of the temporary creature bodies to, like a Bygone Colossus, Anti-Causal Vestige, or even a Phyrexian Soul Gorger. And like I mentioned in all my videos, there really is no downside to including any of these MDFC cards in your decks. Because if you don't need this effect, you can just play the backside of this card, which is a land that taps for green mana, and you can even make it enter untapped for the low cost of 3 life. Null Drifter. This card is basically the Eldrazi version of a Null Drifter. Now I'm gonna be honest, I have never ever cast this card for 7 mana in this deck. The only way I've ever cast it is by using its evoke cost. And the value you get from evoking this creature with Eshki on the battlefield is crazy, because this card then basically reads 3 mana, get a counter on Eshki, and draw 3 cards. Because it also is a 4 power creature entering the battlefield, all of the previous card draw enchantments I just mentioned in this section will also trigger of it, drawing you even more cards. Another auto-include creature you should include in any Eshki deck. Berserk. Now what is a Berserk doing in an Eshki deck? What Berserk essentially does is for 1 mana on instant speed, double a creature's power and give it trample. And if you decided to swing with that creature this turn, you do have to sacrifice it in your end step. Now obviously we don't really want to be swinging with Eshki, but being able to double her power for just 1 mana is absolutely crazy. Because let's say you have her at 5 power and you are able to cast 2 6 power creatures this turn. Normally this would result in Eshki dealing 6 damage, then 7 damage, dealing a total of 13 damage to each opponent. Now let's say before casting those 2 creatures we actually Berserk and get Eshki up to a base power of 10. Now the first trigger will deal 11 damage and the second one will deal 12 damage, dealing a total of 23 damage to each opponent instead of the 13 for just playing an additional 1 mana card. And that's just giving an example, having Eshki at a low amount of power and just casting 2 creatures. Berserk essentially allows you to get a huge power buff onto Eshki for just the 1 mana and deal a ton of damage with the last part of her triggered ability. The amount of games I've won thanks to Berserk in this Eshki deck is absolutely insane, and your opponents never see the damage coming. Food Chain. This is a card I swore I would never ever include in any of my decks, because this card is just honestly broken beyond belief. Food Chain is a 3 mana enchantment that allows you to sacrifice any creature you control on instant speed, and you will get to add X mana to your mana pool in any color. X being the mana cost of the sacrifice creature plus 1. Now the reason I did decide to include Food Chain in this deck is for a couple of reasons. First up, Devon Dragon in my Discord server convinced me to do so. Secondly, Food Chain is just the perfect card for this type of deck, since we can just play a big creature, get some Eshki triggers, sacrifice that creature, and use the mana generated to just cast into the next creature, and we can keep drawing cards and playing creatures. Food Chain will never be a dead card in this deck, and it's honestly one of the best cards in the entire list. And the third and most important reason why I did decide to include Food Chain in this list is because we don't run any tutors to actually go search up the Food Chain, and we also don't play any infinite combos in the deck, which in my opinion make Food Chain a totally fair card to include in this deck. It's not like you will be searching it up every single game and just winning the game on the spot whenever you resolve it. Roaming Throne. Whenever this 4 mana colorless creature enters a battlefield, we have to choose a creature type. It will be the chosen type in addition to its other types, and whenever a triggered ability of the creature of the chosen type we control would trigger, it triggers an additional time. Now obviously you will be naming one of Eshki's types with this effect, since the main reason this card is included in the deck is to just double up on all the Eshki triggers we get. Whenever you play a 6 power creature with Roaming Throne on the battlefield, Eshki will now get 2 counters, you get to draw 2 cards, and she will deal table-wide damage twice. And since Roaming Throne itself is a 4 power creature, whenever you play this, it will also give you a counter on Eshki and draw you a card. Roaming Throne is just such a busted card when you think about it. Due to its stupid ability, it can be almost included in any deck you decide to build. Solfim, Mayhem Dominus. For 4 mana, you get a creature that will double any source of non-combat damage you deal to your opponents. And this card obviously is just crazy combined with Eshki's third trigger. It will just allow her to deal double the damage and make the clock your opponents are on twice as fast. Usually whenever you have Solfim on the battlefield, just casting 2 6 power creatures and getting 2 Eshki triggers will be enough to close out the game on the spot. For 1 generic and 2 red for action mana, you can also discard 2 cards and put an indestructibility counter on Solfim. Later in the game, if you do have some draw engines on the field and you do have a hand filled with cards, this is just a perfect way to protect Solfim, and your opponents will have a really hard time dealing with him. And the last very unique card in this section is Sarkhan's Unsealing. Whenever you cast a creature spell with either power 4, 5, or 6 will deal 4 damage to any target, essentially making any creature you play with any of these powers into some sort of a removal spell, allowing you to deal with some problematic creatures on the board. This effect in itself wouldn't be worth the 4 mana we pay for this enchantment, but whenever we cast a creature spell with power 7 or greater, we get to trigger its last ability. This enchantment will then deal 4 damage to each opponent, and it will also deal 4 damage to each creature or opponent's control, taking a huge chunk out of their life totals and also clearing their entire board. And since in this deck we do play some really low cost creatures with huge powers, like a Galta, a Bygone Colossus, a Phyrexian Soulgorger, it's really easy to trigger this last effect and just take over the game that way. Next up we have the protection and interaction section. One of the biggest downsides to Eshki is once your opponents see what this deck can do, she will be public enemy number 1. And that's why this section is so important. These cards both give you a way to protect Eshki and to disrupt your opponent's game plans. Stubborn Denial. This spell will for 1 blue mana counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 1 generic mana. Now this is a horrible effect, but if we do control a creature with power 4 or greater, we just get to counter any spell for 1 blue mana, which is a really good effect. We will always be controlling a creature with 4 or more power, either be it Eshki with some counters on her or one of the other big creatures in this list, making Stubborn Denial into one of the most efficient counter spells you can play in this deck. Talking about efficient counter spells, an offer you can't refuse. For 1 blue mana you get to counter target non-creature spell, but in return the controller of that spell will get 2 treasure tokens. Now obviously you won't be using this spell to counter a Kodama's Reach for example, but if an opponent is casting a board wipe or casting a removal spell targeted at Eshki, you can just counter the spell for the 1 blue mana, give them some useless treasure tokens in return, but the most important part is that your Eshki will be fine and you will be able to combo off on the next turn. Slip out the back. For 1 mana we get to put a +1/+1 counter counter on target creature. Then target creature phases out. Now phasing out basically means that creature won't exist until its controller's next upkeep. If someone is playing a board wipe or removal spell, you can just phase out Eshki, she won't exist anymore, and at the beginning of your next upkeep you will just get her back. And phasing out also doesn't remove any +1/+1 counters Eshki had on her, they actually get to stay on her, so you don't lose any value in the process. Tyvar's Stand. For 1 green mana plus X, you can give target creature plus XX, hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn. Now first and foremost, you can use this spell for only 1 green mana to protect Eshki from any sort of targeted removal or board wipes, which in itself is already really good. But later in the game, when you do have the mana available, you can invest more mana into this card. It will also boost Eshki's power and it will boost the damage she deals with the third part of her triggered ability. Collective Resistance, a 2 mana instant speed spell that allows you to choose 1 out of 3 options. You can destroy an artifact, you can destroy an enchantment, or you can give a creature hexproof and indestructible until the end of turn. And honestly, all of the options on this card are great. If you have to deal with a Ristic Study, a Phyrexian Altar, you can use this card to do so, and you can just use it as a protection spell to protect your most valuable creatures and Eshki. This card also has the Escalate mechanic, meaning whenever you cast it, you can pay an additional 2 green mana if you want to, and for every extra green mana you paid, you get to pick an additional mode. Now just paying 2 mana for any of these effects is already a really good deal, but paying 3 or 4 mana to just choose the options you like at a given board state is just insane. Versatility like this is really what makes Magic cards go from good to great. Heroic Intervention. All the previous protection spells only gave hexproof and indestructible to 1 permanent. Heroic Intervention will give it to your entire board. And this card honestly is just the perfect answer to board wipes. Cyclonic Rift. For 2 mana on instant speed, we get to bounce target non-land permanent we don't control. Now in itself, this is already some pretty solid value. But Cyclonic Rift is all about its overload mechanic, meaning we can cast a spell by paying 7 mana and we actually get to bounce each non-land permanent we don't control, acting as some sort of a one-sided bounce effect that will just reset the boards of all of your opponents. With the amount of acceleration cards we run in this deck, it really won't be that big of a deal to get to the 7 mana to cast this. Usually your opponents won't be able to make a comeback from this big of a momentum swing. Bridgeworks Battle. This 3 mana sorcery spell will give 1 creature you control +2/+2 and then it will fight another creature you don't control. First up, this card is just a really efficient removal spell. Target Eshki or one of your other creatures, buff it up, and then just pinpoint remove a creature an opponent controls. Since 90% of the time we will be controlling the biggest creatures on the board, you will always win in a fight. The second function of this card is the fact that it will also give a +2/+2 stat boost, which you can use on Eshki to boost her power and make the third trigger of her ability deal more damage to each opponent for that turn. And if you don't need the power boost or the removal spell, you can just play the backside of this card, which once again is a land that taps for green mana, and you can even make it enter untapped for the low cost of 3 life. Fierce Guardianship. For 3 mana, we get to counter target non-creature spell. But if we control our commander, we can cast this spell without paying its mana cost. Because this deck really relies on controlling your commander on the battlefield, having a counter spell that you can cast for free to protect Eshki is just absolutely ridiculous. And the last card in this section is Raise the Palisade. For 5 mana, you get to choose a creature type. Then each creature that's not the chosen type will be returned to its owner's hand. Now we're not some sort of a tribal deck, but this is just a really good card to reset the board and to keep Eshki on the battlefield. Since you can just name human or warrior and all other creatures will be bounced, which usually will be like 99% of the creatures. Even though it will also bounce all your other creatures to your own hand, you can just still cast them on a later turn and get even more Eshki triggers of them. Next up, we have the lands. A deck this fast does need a mana base that can keep up. The lands in this list will ensure that we will have all 3 of our colors available to us at all times. The mana base of this deck is really expensive, but that is the price you pay for getting Eshki out consistently as early as turn 2 or turn 3. We also have some utility lands in the deck, so I'll start by going over those. Boseiju Who Endures. A legendary land that will tap for green mana and it has the channel ability, meaning whenever this card is in your hand, you can activate its ability by paying the mana cost and discarding this card. When you do, you get to destroy target artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land an opponent controls. That opponent will get to search their library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield. And since Channel is an activated ability, your opponents can't actually use counter magic to stop this effect from happening. If you do have the money for them, there really is no reason why you shouldn't play the Channel lands in any of your decks. Mosswort Bridge. This land has the Hideaway 4 mechanic, meaning it will enter the battlefield tapped and we get to look at the top 4 cards of our library. Then we get to pick one of those cards and we get to exile it. For 1 green mana and tapping this land, we then get to cast the exiled card for free. But we can only activate this ability if our creatures have a total power of 10 or greater. In this deck, getting to that 10 power requirement is a really easy thing to do. The fact that the Hideaway mechanic allows you to cast the card for free means that if we do cast a card this way, it will actually give us Eshki triggers. Just imagine Hideawaying an Apex Devastator under this land and then being able to cascade 4 times for just 1 mana and tapping this land. Otawara, Soaring City, the blue channel land. For 4 mana and discarding this land, we get to bounce any target creature, enchantment, artifact, or planeswalker. A really solid option to deal with any problematic things on the battlefield. And if you don't need the channel ability at a given time, you can just play this as some sort of a basic island. And for the normal mana producing lands in this deck, we play 4 fetch lands, 3 shock lands, 3 pain lands, 3 of the bond lands, 2 horizon lands, a Plaza of Heroes, a City of Brass, a Mana Confluence, a Command Tower, an Exotic Orchard, a Horizon of Progress, a Triome, a Mistrise Village, a Reflecting Pool, and for basics we play 3 forests, 2 mountains, and 1 island. And that's it for my in-depth Eshki Temur's Roar deck. And let me tell you, this deck is an absolute blast to pilot. Once Eshki gets going, this deck just pops off. Chaining creature after creature, drawing through half your library, and burning down the table in a couple of turns. If you made it all the way to the end, comment a dragon emoji so I know you watched the entire video. If you want to help me out, hit the like button and hit subscribe. This will really help push out these awesome deck tech videos to more Magic players. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.